What would you do if your own children threw you away and your caregivers treated you like garbage? Most people would give up, but not Joe. At 78 years old, he set a trap so clever, so ruthless, that when the truth finally came out, the people who mocked him wished they had never underestimated him. You should have seen their faces, the judge leaning forward, the jury whispering, the lawyers scrambling. And Joe? He sat there calm, proud, with his hands folded on his lap. Because this wasn't luck. This was his plan all along. But to understand how an old man brought down an entire nursing home, we have to go back to the day Joe's life turned upside down. Joe was 78 years old when his world turned upside down. A retired school teacher. He had spent decades shaping young minds, teaching history and literature with patience and passion. He was the kind of teacher students remembered long after they left school. The one who stayed after class to help, who bought books with his own money, who believed every child had potential. But now, his body had slowed. His knees ached in the mornings. His back complained when he bent too low. And sometimes his memory stuttered. He wasn't helpless, but to his children, he had become an inconvenience. It started small, whispered conversations he overheard in the hallway. "Dad can't live alone anymore," his son Daniel had said. "He'll burn the house down or fall in the shower." His daughter Claire had replied, "We don't have the time to take care of him. Maybe a care home is best." Joe had wanted to shout, "I'm still here. I can hear you." But his pride kept him silent. When they finally sat him down at the kitchen table, Daniel spoke gently. "Dad, we found this wonderful care facility. It's modern, safe, the staff is trained. You'll have company, activities, meals cooked for you." Claire chimed in, "You'll love it there, and it's just temporary, until we figure things out." Joe looked at their faces, busy, hurried, filled with excuses. They weren't asking. They were telling. So, with a heavy heart, he agreed. The first day at Rosewood Nursing Home seemed promising. The building was clean, the reception area smelled faintly of flowers, and the nurse who welcomed him smiled brightly. "Welcome, Mr. Harris," she said, shaking his hand. "You're going to love it here." Joe forced a smile. Maybe it wouldn't be so bad. But the smile faded as the door to his new room shut behind him. The walls were bare, the furniture sterile, and the air carried a faint odor of disinfectant, sharp and cold. It didn't feel like home. That night, as Joe lay in the narrow bed, he whispered to himself, "Just temporary. They promised it's just temporary." The next few days passed slowly. Joe tried to adjust. He joined the others in the common room, where residents sat slumped in wheelchairs, staring blankly at the TV. He attempted small talk. "Beautiful weather today, isn't it?" he said to a man by the window. The man didn't reply. He just blinked, lost in his own world. Meals were rushed. The staff dropped trays on tables without a word. Once, when Joe asked for a glass of water, a nurse snapped, "Can't you wait a second? I'm busy." It stung. Joe wasn't used to being treated like a nuisance. One evening, as he shuffled back to his room, he passed by the nurse's station. He heard laughter. "Old man Harris asked me to help him with his socks again today," one of them joked. "Like I don't have better things to do." They all laughed. Joe's heart sank. They were talking about him. He went to bed that night, staring at the ceiling, feeling smaller than he ever had before. But the worst part wasn't the staff. It was the silence from his children. Weeks passed, and no one came. No visits, no calls, just silence. One Sunday afternoon, as Joe sat in the courtyard, watching the sunlight filter through the trees, he overheard two nurses gossiping. His kids? Oh, they signed the papers, dumped him here, and that's that. Figures. They're probably just waiting for the inheritance. They laughed. Joe clenched his fists. His own children, did they really see him as a burden? Just an old man to push aside? That night, Joe looked at the little clock his granddaughter had once given him. A gift he had brought with him from home. It was small, with brass edges and a ticking hand that glowed faintly in the dark. He whispered to himself, "If they think I'm weak, they're wrong. I didn't spend my life teaching others to stand up for themselves just to end mine in silence." And that was the night Joe began to plan. Joe's first few weeks at Rosewood blurred together in a haze of routines. Breakfast at 7:30 sharp. Pills at 8. Group activities, usually a puzzle or TV time. Lunch at noon. Dinner at 5. Lights out by 9. It was the same every day. Predictable, cold, and lifeless. Joe tried to stay positive. He wrote letters to Claire and Daniel, though no one wrote back. He read the books he had brought with him, worn classics he had taught countless times in his classroom. Dickens, Steinbeck, Shakespeare. But even the words that once set his soul alight felt dull in that place. The staff's indifference grew harder to ignore. One morning, Joe struggled to button his shirt. His fingers, stiff with arthritis, fumbled clumsily. A nurse passing by sighed dramatically. "For God's sake, Mr. Harris, do you need help with everything?" Joe's cheeks burned. He wanted to reply, to remind her that he had once been the man who could tie ties for a whole line of students before graduation ceremonies. But instead, he swallowed his pride and let her yank the buttons into place, her hands rough and impatient. Another evening, Joe rang the call button when he felt dizzy after his medication. Minutes ticked by. No one came. He pressed it again. Nothing. Finally, after nearly an hour, a nurse stormed in. "What now?" she barked. I just felt unwell," Joe whispered. She rolled her eyes. "Then go to sleep. Stop pressing the button, unless it's an emergency." The worst came at night. Joe's room was next to the staff break room, and through the thin walls he heard them talking. "Old Harris is such a pain. Yeah, always whining about something. He thinks he's special just because he used to be a teacher. If he's so smart, why's he in here?" Laughter followed. Cruel, sharp laughter that cut deeper than any insult. Joe lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his chest tight. He wanted to believe it wasn't personal, that maybe they were just tired, overworked. But deep down, he knew, they didn't see him as a human being, just another bed to check off their list. One afternoon, as Joe sat quietly in the common room, he saw something that shattered the last of his hope. An older woman, Mrs. Wilkins, dropped her spoon during lunch. It clattered onto the floor. She bent down, trying to reach it, her hand trembling. Instead of helping, a young nurse smirked and whispered to another, "Look at her," like watching a turtle stuck on its back. They both laughed, walking away as Mrs. Wilkins struggled. Joe's jaw tightened. He stood, shuffled over, and picked up the spoon himself. "There you go, ma'am," he said softly, placing it gently in her hand. Mrs. Wilkins' eyes watered as she whispered, "Thank you." But Joe noticed the way the staff glared at him from across the room. One muttered under her breath, "Mind your own business, Harris." That night, Joe couldn't sleep. He stared at his little brass clock, the ticking sound steady in the silence. His granddaughter's gift, his only piece of comfort. He thought of all the students he had defended in his classroom, the bullied kids, the shy ones, the underdogs. He had always stood up for them, always. And now? Who would stand up for him? The answer came slowly, but with certainty. "I will," he whispered into the dark. The final straw came 2 weeks later. It was Sunday. His children had promised to visit. Joe dressed carefully, wearing his best cardigan, combing his thinning hair. He waited in the lobby, heart pounding with hope. Hours passed. No one came. At dinner, a staff member passed him and snorted, "Still waiting, Harris? Hate to break it to you, but nobody's coming." Joe's chest ached, but he kept his chin up. He refused to let them see his tears. That night, alone in his room, he whispered to himself, "If they think I'm weak, if they think I'm done, they don't know me at all." His eyes shifted to the clock again. His granddaughter had once told him, "It's more than a clock, Grandpa. It's a camera, too. You can record things with it. Just press this button." Joe had laughed at the time, calling it fancy technology. But now, the thought rooted itself in his mind like a seed. A hidden camera. Proof. Slowly, deliberately, Joe reached for the clock. His hands trembled, but his heart felt stronger than it had in weeks. He pressed the button, and for the first time since stepping into Rosewood, Joe smiled. The little brass clock sat innocently on Joe's bedside table, ticking away just as it always had. To the staff, it was nothing more than an old man's sentimental keepsake. But Joe knew better now. Inside its polished frame, the tiny camera's red light blinked faintly, unnoticed by everyone but him. For the first few nights, Joe left it running as he slept. At first, he doubted it would capture much, but the morning after, when he rewound the footage on his granddaughter's old tablet, his stomach nodded. There it was, a nurse barging into his room, yanking the covers roughly and muttering, "Lazy old fool, always sleeping, waste of space." She didn't know she was being watched. Joe sat frozen, the tablet trembling in his hands. Then came another clip, a staff member taking half the dessert from his dinner tray before dropping it on his lap. He had assumed it was a mistake, but the smirk on her face told another story. By the end of the week, Joe had hours of footage, mocking, neglect, little acts of cruelty that no one outside those walls would have believed. But Joe didn't stop there. He began to play his role carefully, pretending to be weaker, slower, needier than he truly was. At dinner, he would accidentally spill water, knowing one nurse would shove him and hiss, "You're useless." At night, he'd press the call button more often, recording the staff's refusal to respond. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was baiting them. One afternoon, in the common room, Joe noticed Mrs. Wilkins again, the frail woman who had dropped her spoon. This time, her blanket slid off her lap, leaving her shivering. Instead of helping, 2 aides snickered. "She's like a child," one whispered. "Yeah, let her freeze. It builds character," the other responded. Joe clenched his jaw. He shuffled over, draped the blanket gently over her knees, and leaned down to whisper, "Don't worry, Mrs. Wilkins. They won't get away with this. Not for much longer." Her watery eyes blinked up at him, filled with gratitude, but also confusion. She couldn't know what he was planning. Not yet. That night, Joe took the biggest risk yet. He left the clock camera running during staff rounds. At 11 p.m., the door opened. 2 nurses entered, carrying his pills. But instead of handing them to him, one laughed and said, "Watch this." She tossed the pills onto the floor and kicked them under the bed. "Oops, guess Harris doesn't get his meds tonight." The other nurse chuckled. "Not like it matters. He'll be gone soon anyway." They both laughed as they walked out. Joe's heart pounded as he replayed the clip the next morning. This wasn't just cruelty. This was dangerous, life-threatening. And it was all on camera. By now, Joe had hours upon hours of evidence. But he knew one thing. Evidence meant nothing unless it left the walls of Rosewood. So he came up with a plan. He remembered Claire once showing him how to email photos from her phone. If he could transfer the footage from the clock to the tablet, and then from the tablet to email, he could send it directly to someone who would care. Not his children. No, he couldn't trust them anymore. They had abandoned him to this place. But the local news station? Or the police? They would have to listen. The first time he tried, his hands shook too much. He fumbled with the tablet, accidentally deleting a clip. He nearly gave up. But then he whispered to himself, "You were a teacher for 30 years, Joe. You taught children how to read, write, and think. You can figure this out." By the 3rd attempt, he succeeded. A file uploaded. Then another. Slowly, the hours of footage began to transfer. Joe's heart hammered with every beep and loading bar. He knew if anyone caught him, they might take the clock, and then all would be lost. But luck was on his side. The staff never noticed. They thought he was just another old man fiddling with his things. They had no idea he was digging their graves. By the end of the week, Joe had sent everything, every cruel laugh, every act of neglect, every word that dripped with malice, to the local authorities and a well-known investigative journalist. All that was left to do now was wait, for the trap had been set. And soon, the hunters would become the hunted. It happened on a Tuesday morning. Breakfast had just been served, a thin, watery porridge Joe could barely stomach, when the silence of the common room was shattered by the sound of heavy footsteps and clicked voices. Uniformed officers stormed through the double doors, followed by 2 people clutching cameras and microphones. The Rosewood staff froze mid-step, trays rattling in their hands. One of the aides muttered, "What the hell?" But it was too late. The lead officer barked, "Everyone step aside. We have a warrant." Joe sat quietly in his chair, spoon in hand, pretending to be confused. But inside his chest swelled. This was it. His plan had worked. The journalist's camera swung toward the residents, capturing their gaunt faces. The dim lighting, the neglect that had been hidden for years. And then, the footage Joe had sent began to play on a tablet held by the officer. The staff's laughter filled the room. Their cruelty, their mockery, their threats, all of it echoed back at them, in front of the residents they had tormented. One nurse's face drained of color. That's illegal recording. He can't." The officer cut her off sharply. "Illegal? You withheld medication. You mocked and assaulted patients. You endangered lives. That's what's illegal." Gasps rippled through the residents. Some began to cry softly. Mrs. Wilkins, frail and shaking, whispered, "Finally, someone sees the truth. The director of the home, a tall man with a polished suit and a permanent sneer, tried to step forward. "This is outrageous. We run a respectable facility." But the journalist cut him down with one brutal sentence. "Respectable? Then why did a 78-year-old man have to set up a hidden camera just to survive?" The director froze. He had no answer. The arrests came swiftly. 2 nurses in handcuffs, 3 aides pulled out of the building. The director himself taken away, shouting about lawyers. The residents watched in stunned silence as the people who had tormented them were dragged out into the sunlight, faces hidden behind raised arms. For the first time in years, the halls of Rosewood echoed not with cruelty, but with justice. Later that afternoon, the journalist approached Joe directly. "Mr. Harris, Joe, you're the reason this came to light. How did you know what to do?" Joe leaned back in his chair, eyes sharp with the fire of a man who had lived long enough to see the worst in people and outsmart them anyway. "I was a teacher once," he said simply. "I spent my life showing children how to uncover the truth. I just did the same thing here. They thought I was old, weak, easy to silence. But they forgot one thing." He looked directly into the camera, voice steady, deliberate. "Even an old man can be dangerous when you underestimate him." Within days, the story hit national headlines. Elderly man exposes nursing home abuse with hidden camera. Joe's children, ashamed and guilty, came rushing back. But Joe greeted them with a calm distance. "You left me here," he told them, "and I survived without you. Don't come running now that the world knows my name." They lowered their heads, speechless. As for Joe, life finally changed. Rosewood was shut down, its staff jailed or disgraced. The residents were relocated to a new home, one filled with warmth, genuine care, and dignity. Mrs. Wilkins gripped Joe's hand one evening and whispered, "You saved us." Joe smiled softly. "No, I just refused to let them win." And in the quiet that followed, Joe realized something. Revenge wasn't just about punishment. It was about restoring dignity. About making sure no one, not him, not Mrs. Wilkins, not anyone forgotten by the world, would ever be silenced again. And with that, Joe closed his eyes and rested, not as a victim, not as an abandoned old man, but as the hero of his own story.